welcome everybody. We've got a really interesting theme today that we're going to be talking through, precarious work and the digital economy. I think this is one of the areas where there is the greatest concern about the impact of artificial intelligence. And if we're not careful, people will get so concerned about the nature of artificial intelligence in the workplace and the potential for misuse, surveillance, and so on, that there's an inclination to forget that there may well be benefits as well. What I think we're trying to do is really unpack as much as we can about the potential in the workplace, seen from very different perspectives by people who've actually taken quite a lot of time and trouble to look at those implications. And I'm delighted to say we've got Alexandra Reeve Gibbons, who's the President and CEO for the Centre for Democracy and Technology. We've got Dr. Abigail Gilbert, Head of Research Institute for the Future of Work, James Farrar, Founder and Director, Worker Information Exchange, Mary Towers, Employment Rights Officer at the TUC, and Justin Andersen, who's the Head of Strategy at Andersen Strategy. And what we're doing is we're going to give each of our speakers 5 minutes or so to set the scene, and then we're going to open it up for questions. What I normally do at the end of each speaker's session is just ask a provocative question before we go on to our next speaker. And that's, I think, what we'll do today. We sadly don't have Stephen Metcalf, my co-chair, with us today. He's been detained elsewhere, but we do have some of our senior parliamentarians in the form of Lord Errol, the Earl of Errol, and Lord Holmes as well. We will be taking quite a bit of this on board for parliamentary purposes, I have absolutely no doubt as well. So we're going to start off with Alexandra Gibbons, President and CEO of Centre for Democracy and Technology. Over to you, Alexandra. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to join you all today. I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., and it's very nice to be with you. I'm the President and CEO of the Centre for Democracy and Technology. We're a 25-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization with offices in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, and we focus on protecting human rights and democratic values in the digital age. One issue we prioritize is the impact of technology on workers' rights, including workers' privacy, their health and well-being in the workplace, their ability to organize, and the risk of discrimination. As this group has heard over the course of your inquiry, employers are increasingly turning to technological tools to monitor and evaluate workers' activities. This is happening across industries, in factories, in delivery services, commercial workplaces, and home offices. The tech advocacy world I am part of often describes these types of tools using the umbrella term of Bossware. Today, Bossware tracks the individual movements of warehouse workers as they scan and box items for delivery. It logs employees' keystrokes on the computer, the time spent using a particular software program, and the websites that workers visit. It takes photos through workers' webcams to check if they were at their computer at a given time. It analyzes staff emails and social media accounts. In addition to worker tracking, companies are also using Bossware to evaluate and manage their workers too. Bossware composes several distinct risks. An obvious one is the risk to privacy. While important protections are afforded by the UK GDPR and other laws, the existence of tools that can monitor workers in such extraordinary depth continue to raise deep concerns, both about the information employers can access and what they do with that information. Such access can undermine workers' personal privacy, and it increases the risk of discrimination based on information employers learn or infer about their workers' lives. In addition, monitoring of workers' email, social media, and workplace break rooms can impede workers' ability to question company practices and to organize with other workers. Our advocacy at CDT also underscores the risk that Bossware has for workers' health, which I understand is one of the main areas of focus today. Increasingly, technology tools guide every action a worker takes in the name of optimizing workflow. News reports have documented the safety violations experienced by delivery drivers who were rushing to stay on schedule. Workers have reported being unable to go to the bathroom or take other small personal breaks. As one factory worker said, it's the automatically enforced pace of work rather than the physical difficulty of the work itself that makes the job so grueling. Any slack is perpetually being optimized out of the system, and with that, any opportunity to rest or recover. In warehouses and factories, this can take the form of a signal that guides a worker to the next item to be boxed. That speeds up their workflow, but in doing so, removes even that microsecond of downtime when they look for the item on the shelf. In a home office, this can take the form of a program that photographs a worker through their webcam at periodic intervals to make sure they're at the computer. In so doing, punishing the worker for something as innocuous as going to the restroom. These measures contribute directly to job strain, which occurs when workers face high job demands but have little control over their work. The level of surveillance is stressful, it's demoralizing, and it damages workers' dignity. When it prevents workers going to the bathroom or taking small breaks in physical labor, it can cause both psychological and physical harm. This management approach can also particularly discriminate against people with disabilities, a conversation that is often overlooked when we think about AI harms. It requires people to complete tasks in a particular way or at a particular pace, instead of an alternative manner that accommodates their needs. Tools used for algorithmic management can also undermine workers' agency and their legal rights. For example, some employers in the retail sector are evaluating workers' performance based on scores they receive from observed data or analysis of their customer interactions. This opaque system can punish workers for factors beyond their control, like a waiter receiving low ratings because of the quality of a restaurant's food, not the quality of their service, or because of customers' racial, religious, or other biases. Delivery drivers can be flagged for delays caused by external factors like traffic or the location of the delivery, yet they're required in some cases to recover the lost time throughout their shift. In other settings, companies are using predictive analytics to identify which workers are potential flight risks. Such analysis may cause workers to receive differential treatment based on the company's inferences about them, again, using opaque factors beyond the individual's control. Members of Parliament have an important opportunity to raise awareness about these technologies and mitigate their risks. Employers must be challenged to directly consider the impacts of algorithmic systems and to do so with workers, especially those from historically excluded groups, present at the table and empowered to shape those conversations in a meaningful way. Thank you for your attention to these important issues. I'll be happy to elaborate on questions in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. What you've done is you've highlighted some of the real issues around the use of artificial intelligence in the workplace and the problems that ensue and the unfairness, in a sense, of people being subjected to judgments which often don't, they have no control over the factors that determine performance. But what you didn't really do, you talked about challenging employers, but do you actually believe that there should be regulation that would prescribe the use of these technologies in the workplace?
I do. There are some important bones already in place. There are strong equality laws on the books, and the GDPR has meaningful protections. But at the same time, the use of these systems requires real guidance to employers and pressure on them to audit these systems and do impact assessments before they are used, and then while they are being deployed, to continually consider what the negative risks might be for workers, think about whether these tools are truly necessary and justified by their business interests, and make sure, as I mentioned, that workers are present in those conversations so we truly can understand the harms, and employers have to be required to address them.
So really, you're asking for an employer mindset to change in terms of impact assessment and so on. Well, no doubt we'll come to talk about how realistic that is without regulation, of course. So on to Dr. Abby Gilbert, who's the head of research at the Institute for the Future of Work, who published a recent report. Abby.
Thank you very much, Tim, and also Alexandra for your evidence, which is really interesting to hear and finds similar things to our own. So as Tim said, I'm Abigail. I work for the Institute for the Future of Work. We are a research and development institute looking to build a fairer future of better work through technological transition. And today I'll be speaking to our findings from the a report that we titled The Amazonian Era, the Gigification of Work. So what are we getting at with that Amazonian bit? Well, essentially, we're implying that in the same way that Henry Ford came to define the kind of models of business that were perceived as successful across the economy in his own time, Amazon is beginning to define what businesses see as a kind of aspirational progressive business model. And this kind of conclusion was reached through a substantial empirical project that we conducted over the course of a year and a half in the UK, throughout COVID, looking at transformations as a result of the introduction of algorithmic systems used to surveil and manage workers. And this began in the retail sector, but extended across a range of essential work sectors as we sort of followed the technology of connected worker platforms as they were being rapidly adopted across maintenance, manufacturing, engineering, and food processing sectors. So a lot of these kind of industries where through the pandemic, they were still running, they were essential work. So managers were still wanting to minimize their presence on perhaps on the shop floor, but have a sense of what was going on. And algorithmic management, or Bossware, as Alexandra kind of described it, was a key part of this. So these connected worker platforms specifically are a kind of cloud-based software tool which can be downloaded from the App Store onto the mobile phones of workers and essentially install the kind of logic of gigification into a business. So to unpack that a little bit, across all of the industries and businesses that we looked at, which have completely different operating contexts, completely different business functions, we did find this kind of common process of transforming work, which we refer to as the human data cycle. And this regulates and transforms work through three key stages. And I'll use retail as my example here, but this kind of logic of these three steps could be seen across any of the organizations that we looked at from the various sectors that I just described. So the first of these is representation. In this, work becomes defined as what can be measured by the algorithmic system. So for instance, that might be the number of items that are swiped across the till by a cashier, or perhaps they're also monitored with heat sensors for the number of people that are in the queue at any time. Again, as Alexandra mentioned, often these factors are beyond the control of the worker, but the system comes to measure their performance on this basis. So we've got representation. In the second stage is standard setting. So algorithmic prediction increasingly schedules tasks as those tasks have been measured and monitored through the first stage, and schedules them at the kind of intensity of the best performer. So keeping with our retail example, if we look at those unloading crates from delivery vans into the supermarket overnight, the fittest, likely strongest, youngest, probably male, would begin to set the rate for the rest of the team as algorithmic prediction would schedule this. So again, we can see there one of the clear examples of how equality would be a consideration in this new form of standard setting. And then finally, intervention. So how is this new kind of regime upheld, this kind of intensified work process? Well, it's through behavior change that can come through either social or material nudges, although calling the material one nudges is perhaps generous. So for instance, gamification can lead to rewards. So those who perform the most tasks we found were rewarded sometimes with Amazon vouchers or stars and ratings, or directly through contract changes. So in a number of the businesses that we'd spoken to, the combination of this measuring and predicting work had been combined with a restructuring of the task force to 0 hours contracts, in which work was more flexible to the demand as it was dictated by the market at each time of year. So we can see there how that package begins to kind of transform work to this kind of gigification model. But we also found more troubling evidence from our review of the introduction of these systems in so-called skilled work sectors. So just as I suppose Uber incorporated insights into routes, which used to be held as kind of what some people might describe as human capital among workers in that sector, connected worker platforms seek to encode the methods of work for workers across a number of different industries, including engineers that are involved in manufacturing and maintenance. And the idea of this is that the methods of work will become encoded in a kind of easy to access consumer standard app kind of format, so that essentially anybody could do the job. And as the developers of these systems suggested to us, this would basically mean that whenever work could go gig, it will go gig. So there's a design objective within these systems to transform the whole of work into a gig economy. And whether or not that can be realized, we think that that's something that is quite concerning and requires concerted action by government. So on the back of this, we are advocating for the government to firstly initiate an Accountability for Algorithms Act. And we believe that this should feature ex-ante algorithmic impact assessments, that there could be preemptive mitigation of some of these impacts and harms, but in a process that would also account for post-deployment monitoring, as Alexandra also mentioned the importance of. We also believe that this Accountability for Algorithms Act should feature a schedule of digital rights at work. And finally, we believe that the government should initiate a cross-government Work 5.0 strategy to ensure that the objective of well-being and good work can be prioritised through technological change. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed, Abby. Very interesting, because what you're proposing is an Algorithmic Accountability Act at just the point where the government are beginning to think about their AI governance white paper coming down the track. How would that fit together with, if you like, the overarching, a more kind of horizontal form of regulation dealing with AI? Are you asking for a particular form of risk assessment, for instance, or impact assessment, or do you think it would fit within a broader AI governance structure?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's absolutely great that the government have recognised that there's a need for further regulation in this space. And we do believe that there needs to be an overarching corporate responsibility for undertaking these assessments. So while it's really encouraging that there's today been a transparency code announced for public sector algorithms, we believe that this question goes beyond transparency to necessitate not just impact assessment, but then mitigation of those impacts. And I suppose we particularly believe and endorse that in the context of work, the Good Work Charter, which is a synthesis of fundamental social, economic and human rights as they apply to the workplace, would be a good kind of metric on which to base those evaluations of impacts on work. But fundamentally, work is not a sector, so we do not believe that a sectoral approach is needed to develop regulation that can effectively respond to this, and that a more comprehensive duty is required.
Yeah, and not only risk assessment across the board, but the duty to mitigate at the same time, which I think is something we need to hang on to when thinking about AI governance, you know, right through. Great, thank you very much indeed. And now on to James Farrar, who's the founder and director of the Worker Info Exchange.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me on this panel. I really appreciate it. My name is James Farrar. I'm director of Worker Info Exchange and a recovering worker myself. Worker Info Exchange is a non-profit organisation that researches and advocates for workers and worker rights and digital rights in the gig economy. We're aiming to aggregate worker data in data trusts, and we also engage in strategic litigation. I can see there's a question about one of the pieces of litigation we're involved in the questions in the group already, which we may get to. The story of the gig economy has too often been one of misclassification of workers and the casualization of work. In some cases, this has led to platform employers going to great lengths to conceal management control so as not to betray an employment relationship. And increasingly, the means for doing this is through hidden algorithmic management control. I'm one of the lead claimants in the Uber case that was resolved at the Supreme Court earlier this year, which we started in 2015. And my theory is that if we were to try to start that case today, we may not be successful, because a lot of the evidence of management control that we had access to back in 2014, 2015, most platform employers have carefully hidden that away now. So in order to prove that you're a worker entitled to rights, you have to present evidence in court, in tribunal, of this management control. And increasingly that's been hidden from gig workers in particular. At the same time, mass platform employers such as Uber and Deliveroo are anyway set up quite deliberately to completely automate management processes. That is the business model. Work is digitally mediated, so there is no regular office to go to. There's no identifiable HR department. And when drivers and couriers raise a concern via the channels available to them in-app, often the responses are comically semi-automated using natural language processing systems, which can lead to quite odd results. And key management processes such as recruitment, work allocation, performance management, and pricing are highly, if not completely, automated in the gig economy. Now, the problem arises when workers are subject to piecework terms and conditions of precarious employment. Are some drivers or couriers profiled in a certain way that could mean they receive less valuable work or less frequent work? Are other workers profiled in a way that it's favorable because they accept work at lower yielding prices at lower pay levels compared to others? Are some workers unfairly dismissed due to being incorrectly flagged for security reasons? In recent times, we've seen a proliferation of surveillance tech in the gig economy. In September 2020, the Westminster Magistrates Court made real-time identification of Uber drivers a condition of Uber's license when they won back their license after TfL refused renewal. And that set off a chain of events where many more gig employers in the UK are using real-time identification systems, including facial recognition. Uber's introduced Microsoft's Face API facial recognition system as a component of their real-time ID system. Since then, Bolt has already heavily invested in facial recognition, as so has Deliveroo, Ola, Cabs, and others. And while these systems have undoubted safety and security benefits for consumers, it's not always clear that the objective really always is safety, and if such fairly extreme surveillance measures are proportionate and reasonable. It's also apparent that anti-fraud surveillance too often has a dual objective: to not only prevent and detect fraud, but is also used as a means of hidden performance management. So to give you some real-world examples of what I'm talking about, performance management. A driver we've worked with received a final warning from Uber for engaging in fraudulent activity. Now, when he challenged this with our help and through making data subject access requests, he eventually got a human on the phone to say to him that they didn't understand either why he had been flagged for this, and started to question him about what he might have done wrong. So rather than management answering the question of the worker of what it is that he was supposed to have done wrong, they kind of turned the tables on him. But after we made subject access requests, it was chalked up to being a glitch, and an apology came from Uber at that time. But it is a sign of how these systems are not always understood, not only by the workers, but by the people managing these systems as well. We've got another driver who when the work allocation system wasn't working, became so frustrated with dealing with the natural language processing solution that was a sort of a semi-automated response that he threatened suicide, and just to get through the bot responses. And he was suspended and sent for evaluation. But it gives you an example of the frustration that workers have in dealing with these types of systems. In terms of pricing, pay, and work allocation, Uber recently updated their privacy policy to reflect automated decision-making in two key areas that are integrated: pricing and work allocation. So Uber has introduced pricing systems which are now constantly dynamic according to real-time supply and demand market signals. But Uber also recently acknowledged that automated work allocation decisions are based in part on driver profiles which take into account other factors, such as likelihood to accept a trip based on their past behavior or preference. Now, when you consider both of these factors together, we must conclude that drivers who accept all jobs offered, even those lower yielding jobs, will be preferred in future work allocation decision-making. So drivers holding out for higher pay may be punished for doing so. Bolt, on the other hand, the second biggest platform for rideshare in Britain, provides no information at all on automated decision making that their workers are almost certainly subjected to. For anti-fraud detection systems, through Worker Info Exchange, the App Drivers and Couriers Union brought a case to court in Amsterdam, and 6 Uber drivers were ordered to be reinstated by the court and paid damages for when they were terminated by automated means after incorrect flagging for fraudulent behavior. Ola cabs and Free Now profile drivers based on a prediction of fraudulent behavior. So these are fraud prediction scores that are then used in profiles for work allocation. Now, we say that conflation of work allocation decision-making and anti-fraud detection is wrong. You know, fraud is something to be detected and removed. It isn't something to be used as a prioritization in work allocation, but both of those platforms do so. Facial recognition, another problem area. We have worked with the App Drivers and Couriers Union to identify 2 drivers who were incorrectly flagged by Microsoft's Face API used by Uber. And one of these drivers, you know, Uber now recognizes it was mistakenly flagged, but lost his job for 3 months. Now, this is using a technology that Microsoft themselves have stopped selling to US police forces because they recognize that it has some serious flaws, particularly when used with people of color. It is a 12% failure rate for people of color and 20% failure rate overall for women of color. So that case is going now with the App Drivers and Couriers Union and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission as an example of a case of clear discrimination. So I'll stop there, but you know what is clear from us, from our research and our work with workers, is that we do really need to strengthen access and transparency rights for workers, all workers, and not just those classified as employees. And the rights that we do have under the UK GDPR just simply are not being respected by most gig employers. We're very concerned about the DCMS proposals, which would reduce those access rights and remove Article 22 protections. And also there's a need for greater transparency and greater explanation of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making that's used in the workplace. I think I better stop here for now. Thank you very much.
James, thank you very much indeed. I mean, clearly greater transparency is needed, but it doesn't stop there, surely. And you may want to expand, you know, Article 22 rather than get rid of it, as the DCMS paper appears to want to do. But what about something along the lines that Abby was talking about in terms of an Algorithmic Accountability Act that would actually insist on risk assessment and actually deem certain uses of AI beyond the pale, so to speak, as too high risk?
Yeah, we totally endorse that recommendation that Abby suggested, and also I think some that Mary will probably speak about next, and that the TUC are advocating for strengthening of the rights of explanation of automated decision making and algorithmic control at work.
Because I mean, simply off the back of the Uber case, you did win a great victory, but on the other hand, you know, what you've succeeded in doing is making these companies alter their behavior to become more secretive rather than more open, by the sound of it.
Yeah, and that's it. That's absolutely what has happened, and that is absolutely the risk going forward. I mean, I still feel that even you know, one of the things that we've learned about dealing with Uber through the Supreme Court is that, you know, it is great to talk about these additional laws that we might enact and so on, but it's very important that we start enforcing the laws we do have, and those are just simply not being enforced very well at the moment. We've already got some great remedies under GDPR, but we risk losing them. But they're also very difficult to enforce as it is at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And now on to Mary Towers, who's the Employment Rights Policy Officer at the TUC. Mary.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And firstly, thanks so much for inviting the TUC to contribute today. We really appreciate it. So I'm an employment rights policy officer at the TUC, and the TUC represents around about 48 affiliate trade unions, bringing together 5.5 million working people. For the past year and a half, I've been leading on a TUC project looking at the use of AI and automated decision-making in the employment relationship, working alongside a group of affiliate trade unions, international union confederations, and legal advisors. I'll start by outlining the TUC's project and then give some brief insights into the extent to which AI is being used in all aspects of people management, the impact on worker well-being, and our proposals for how to protect workers against potential harms caused by management by AI, as well as proposals for workers and unions to benefit from the potential opportunities offered by AI. So turning first to an overview of the TUC's AI project, in the summer of 2020, we carried out a survey of workers and trade union reps and commissioned Britain Thinks polling and carried out a literature review. And our intention was to gain general insights into the types of technologies being used to recruit and manage people at work, the lived experience of these technologies, and the implications for workers and unions. And we published our research findings last November in our Technology Managing People, the Worker Experience report. And we then commissioned Robin Allen QC and Dee Masters to write a legal report, setting out the legal tools available to workers when AI goes wrong, identifying gaps in the existing law and guidance, and making a series of recommendations for reform. And this legal report was published at the end of March this year. And at the same time, we published our manifesto for change. So having given you an overview of our project, moving on now to some of the findings of our research. So firstly, AI and people management. We found that the use of AI to manage people takes place in almost all areas of the employment relationship, with training, monitoring, recruitment, and line management functions being the most common areas in which people are experiencing the use of AI-powered technologies. We also highlight that the use of AI to recruit and manage people has spread far beyond the so-called gig economy and into more traditional employment relationships, as well as into an incredibly wide range of sectors. And moving on to impact on worker well-being, these are some of our findings relating to the impact of technologies on worker well-being. Firstly, mental health. Our research found evidence of a connection between some aspects of management by AI and negative impact on mental health. Workers reported feeling dehumanized and being viewed merely as a series of statistics. Some workers described a sense of isolation and loneliness due to reduced human contact, saying that today's workplace has become an unfriendly and sad environment, and that work is increasingly robotic, alienating, monotonous, and lonely. And we also found evidence that being unable to challenge or understand decisions made by AI can lead to stress-related ill health. A lack of understanding of technology and a lack of transparency over how technology operates both seem to contribute to an inability of workers and trade unions to challenge decisions made by AI. And union reps and workers also reported an always-on culture, with digital devices and home working having increased working hours and blurred the boundaries of home and work and family life. Many workers also reported a deep sense of unease and stress at work caused by constant monitoring and surveillance, with comments including, going to work just isn't enjoyable anymore as you're scrutinised and watched over constantly. And then a second implication in terms of physical safety. So we found evidence of AI setting punishing rates of work based on productivity goals or unrealistic targets, failing to take into account context and environment. And this led to unsustainable work intensification and unnecessary risks and injuries. And then finally, lack of power and opportunity and benefit. We found connections between management by AI and inequality of power, and inequality of opportunity and benefit for workers. And we believe that the entrenchment of existing inequalities in power structures by AI systems is a significant danger. For example, this entrenchment of inequality takes place where AI is repeating patterns of discrimination and bias, where AI is used to facilitate low-paid and insecure work, and James has spoken to that in some detail, and where workplace AI is developed only to advance commercial interests at the exclusion of all others, and also where there's an imbalance of power over worker data. So TUC proposals to address these issues. Well, in our AI manifesto, we set out a full programme of reform, including some really pragmatic measures to fill gaps in the existing legislation and provide additional guidance and also strengthen worker voice. But in my evidence giving, I'd like to just highlight some aspects of our manifesto that are of particular relevance to worker wellbeing. Firstly, we believe that employers should respect the importance of clear work-home boundaries and the importance of human contact. Human contact and human interaction and human agency are of fundamental importance to the well-being of workers. And we say that human beings shouldn't ever be subject to absolute technological control. To protect these values, we propose a universal right to human review of high-risk decisions that are being made by technology about workers, and a statutory right to in-person engagement, so a statutory right to one-to-one in-person engagement at work, and a right to disconnect from digital devices. And then in terms of transparency and explainability, we say that both of those values are absolutely key to worker well-being. And so employers should only be permitted to use AI and automated decision-making to make important decisions about job applicants and workers, where those decisions can be sensibly explained and easily understood by workers. And also that workers should have information readily available to them about how AI is operating in the workplace and exactly how that is applying in relation to them as an individual. And so in that respect, we propose a new obligation on employers to disclose how AI is being used in the workplace in the statement of employment particulars, plus a new obligation on employers to maintain a register that's accessible to both job applicants and workers with this information about how AI is being used at work, and then a universal right to explainability of how AI and ADM automated decision-making systems are operating at work, with a right to a personalised explanation. And then in our manifesto, we also make various proposals aimed at redressing the inequality of power and opportunity and benefit for workers that I mentioned earlier on in my statement. We have to take radical steps to redress the imbalance of power over data at work and enable workers to start benefiting from AI and producing AI that is based on worker interests, furthering worker interests. And to do this, we say that there should be a positive right to data reciprocity, whereby workers have a right to collect and combine their own workplace data, and that unions could potentially adopt new data-related roles, gathering and analysing worker data, and then developing worker-led AI-powered tools. And regarding equality and fairness, our manifesto includes a range of proposals to guard against discrimination and unfairness, including routing liability for discrimination all the way up the AI value chain. And last but not least, taking into account the worker perspective is absolutely key to ensuring that AI operates fairly at work. And in this respect, collective agreements are the ideal vehicle to resolve many of the problems associated with the use of AI at work. And our affiliate unions have already done some fantastic work with collective agreements in this area. And we also advocate a new statutory duty to consult workers and unions where employers are considering applying AI at work to make important decisions about people. As a final remark, I hope this statement provides evidence of the urgency for action in relation to regulation of the use of AI at work, as well as other measures, and the importance of taking into account the worker perspective in both the development and application of AI at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mary. I mean, we're seeing a kind of worrying trend, which everybody's reflecting, of employers simply putting in AI systems, performance management, monitoring, and so on and so forth, without any real governance at all, informing the ethics of the use or the intention or the impact in the first place. I mean, what sort of response have you had to your report and your proposals from employers? I mean, you talk about the collective agreements, but I mean, more broadly, have you had a response from people like the CBI or other employer organisations?
So we've had actually some quite positive response from employers. I mean, just to give an insight, I had a meeting with a group of HR directors not so long ago who had also experienced some of the same problems that workers have in terms of understanding technology and actually communicating about technology. And one of the areas that we're really keen on is working collaboratively with employers. For example, we want to roll out training programs to help workers and reps communicate about technology. And that's something that we think that we could also kind of share and offer to employers to share that and work together with them to enable both workers and managers to communicate together about technologies. And I also understood from the HR directors I was talking to that they found it quite difficult to ensure that they were actually getting exactly what they wanted from the technologists, technology that actually accurately reflected the employment relationship. So in a way, it's a two-way problem.
There's quite a bit of ignorance really involved in quite a bit of this as well. But nevertheless, even though you think you can get agreement and so on, you still believe that needs to be underpinning by legislation.
We think that what's needed is essentially a multi-pronged approach. It's not really a case of one thing or another. Absolutely, there need to be measures taken to ensure that there are appropriate steps being taken at development stage, but also at application stage. And in addition, we do have an existing legislative structure in place that provides some very important protections for workers when AI goes wrong. And so whatever happens, there needs to be that secure safety net to ensure that if there are new provisions dealing with the development stage, that if those fail in some way, there is then a safety net for workers for some form of redress if things still go wrong. Plus, on top of that, not only is regulation important, but of course, we say collective bargaining. And collective bargaining provides a perfect vehicle to ensure that there are sector-specific solutions. Different types of technologies are of differing importance in different sectors. And so collective agreements provide a very flexible method for groups of workers to find solutions that match their particular sector.
Mary, thanks very much indeed. And now over to Justin Andersen, who's the head of strategy at Andersen Strategy, and also happens to be one of the founders of this all-party group. Justin.
Thank you, Tim. And also I have another role, which is CEO of Expert AI, which is actually a spin out from Andersen Strategy. It's a joint venture that builds human-centric neural networks for a positive social impact. That's AI about the human body and the brain. And it's so I'm going to be talking about that area. One of the things we're doing is working with a team of neuroscientists across the world, some eminent neuroscientists from UK universities, and we're building out models of neuronal activity in the brain, which helps us to assist with the diagnosis of neurological disorders, and ultimately could go as far as to help you with a headache if it can be picked up using electric signals from the brain that we can manage. And we bring in data from all sorts of rich sources, including cameras and electrodes positioned on scalps, picking up electrical activity. And the direction of this technology that we're building is going in is ultimately to find ways of being able to interface directly with a computer just using the power of thought. So clearly this is a very sensitive and requires a lot of ethical consideration. And in fact, Merlin has recently agreed to help us with heading up our ethics committee. But our tech is also being used in other ways for facial voice gesture recognition. We've worked to understand the impact of the facial nerve on emotions in order to monitor wellness, but also we've explored employee compliance, which I think gets to the nub of what several people have talked about here. But I'd like to point out that right now we're on a recorded video. Behind some of us is personal information, and this is the area that I'd like to move into, which is building on some of the legal and regulatory issues that is associated with our work using computer vision and NLP monitoring video calls, especially from the Home Office. So we've been working with banks and insurance companies and credit bureaus in this sort of discovery phase where they're trying to understand how they might be able to manage the communications that they are responsible for recording in some cases in a more effective way. Just to be clear about this particular part of what we do, none of the banks or anybody else is using electrodes on any of their workers, as far as I'm concerned. This is all video that we're looking at to be able to understand what's happening. So in the UK, of course, the banks are regulated by the FCA, but they specifically state that a firm must take reasonable steps to record telephone conversations and keep a copy of electronic communications that relate directly to certain issues, such as arranging deals and managing investments. And whilst they note that in Market Watch 66, they noted that the pandemic has had a significant effect on how businesses are run, and that the new technologies, including Zoom and Teams, are coming into our daily lives, and we're seeing the increased home working. But despite all of that, they still have the expectation that the firms continue to comply with the recording obligations and have a rigorous monitoring regime in place to reduce the risk of misconduct. And we've seen within the last decades that banks have been exposed to massive risks in misconduct, and therefore potentially this is an area where there is some justification around certain monitoring activities. Now, whilst of course not all of the communication in banks has moved across into Zoom and Teams, in many cases it has, and it is being recorded. So essentially the UK financial world, its regulatory regime, could result in certain video conversations being recorded within an employee's home. So with that in mind, we need to consider the impact of GDPR on this particular area. Of course, it sets out a legal framework for the collection and processing of personal information. And under GDPR, a photograph and a video is classified as someone's personal data. But contrary to popular belief, GDPR doesn't require businesses to obtain consent from people using their personal information for business purposes. In any case, relying on consent, given what some of the former speakers have said, is probably not a good thing due to the imbalance of power between the employer and the employee in any case. But under GDPR, consent is just one of 6 legal bases that justify processing of personal data. Actually, if there is a legal obligation, as in the FCA requiring these calls to be recorded, then in fact, you don't need the consent of the user. Although under Article 13, of course, they're obliged to provide information on how personal data is stored and processed and what purpose of processing is. And so the register that was talked about earlier by Mary ultimately, is perhaps linked into Article 13, just making sure we understand where that personal data is stored. And of course, there might be other categories of personal information that need to be considered. And so, for example, perhaps I've got some information behind me that looks at my religious beliefs. Well, they would be covered under Article 9. Or there may be some information that could be picked up about my health from biometric beliefs or data. And so these are covered under Article 9. But I think there's a risk that without requiring consent to record and store videos, or active consent, if there's any lack of provision about the information about the use of video surveillance, it could potentially lead to a breach of our civil liberties and specifically our rights to privacy. Just remind you, the principles of GDPR are rooted, of course, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which itself, of course, has its roots in our Magna Carta, written nearly 800 years ago. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there isn't actually anything that says rights to privacy. However, it does state that no one shall be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Now, clearly, that's not legally binding in our courts. The UDHR isn't legally binding, but employers' rights are not just protected by the courts, and the threat of potential media scandal or backlash showing some kind of big brother ignoring civil liberties may actually provide greater protection, and certainly will keep boards up at night worrying about any potential backlash. But in terms of providing further guidance, the Information Commissioner's Office have published the Employment Practices Code, which helps employees comply with the Data Protection Act, which sits now alongside the GDPR. And it sets out guidelines regarding the processing of personal data in the employment context. I believe it reflects the intent of our human rights in respect of our workers' rights of privacy. But it says specifically, if employers monitor they don't recommend employers monitoring, but if they do monitor their workers, they should be very clear about the purpose and satisfied that the particular monitoring arrangement is justified by real benefits that will be delivered. So that's the real key to it. And workers must be made aware of the nature, extent, and reasons for monitoring, unless in exceptional circumstances, covert monitoring is justified.
Very interesting, because what you seem to be implying is that actually we have a framework that should be enforced more readily than it already is being, i.e. that you think that the ICO and data protection impact assessments should be much more readily enforced, in a sense, given if you like, the practices that are currently taking place under data protection law, rather than necessarily having to invent a whole new raft of legislation. But we'll come back to that, I think, because maybe what we need is a short-term and a long-term approach to this. So we enforce data protection now, and expect to put in place a broader framework in the future in terms of transparency and so on. But I need to come to Raj now, so that we allow ourselves some time for questions at the end. Professor Raj Choudhury, who's the Lumry Family Associate Professor at Harvard Business School. Raj, nice to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. So my expertise, just to summarize, is the future of work, which I've been studying for close to a decade now, much before the pandemic. And I've been studying both remote work and also AI and machine learning. So I thought I'll summarize my research into a few core insights that I've learned along the way. So I've been studying a form of remote work that I call work from anywhere. And the key distinction between work from anywhere and the work from home model that is also very prevalent these days is that in work from anywhere, the worker gets to choose which town, city, or state, and even sometimes which country she wants to live in. And so what my research has found is that work from anywhere is a win for the worker, it's a win for the organization, and it can be a win for society in the following way. The worker benefits in many, many ways. She could move to a cheaper location to live, and if wages are held constant, that means more real income. The worker could move closer to family, and raising children closer to family, needless to say, is a much preferred option. The worker could prevent immigration constraints that would, in some cases, prevent the worker from working in certain geographies. I've found work from anywhere to be especially helpful for dual career families, because now you don't have to think about two jobs in every location you move to. From the perspective of the organization, work from anywhere has three main benefits. Firstly, the organization can now hire from anywhere. So instead of being constrained by the local labor market of London or whichever city or town the company has an office in, now you can hire from anywhere, not only all over UK, but all over the world. The second benefit is, under some conditions, my experimental research has shown that work from anywhere leads to higher productivity. In fact, I studied this much before the pandemic in the United States Patent Office, and I found a productivity gain of 4.4%. The third thing I found in my research is work from anywhere leads to a more equal organization, because there's at least 2 decades of research which has shown how geography has constrained the careers of women. So even if the woman has a great promotion or a great job, the spouse or the children don't want to move, and she has to often forego that option. And finally, there are real estate savings and utility savings to the company. To society, the main benefit of work from anywhere is that now the workforce can distribute more equally all over the country. And so instead of all the agglomeration of labor being in the mega cities, now workers can, and this includes both high-skilled and semi-skilled workers, they can move to smaller towns, making the labor distribution more equal. So my policy suggestions for this esteemed group is the following. First, there are many countries now which have understood the opportunity that remote work creates and work from anywhere creates. And they are creating special visa categories, notably the digital nomad visa category. And this is a large number of countries now. Prior to the pandemic, it was only Estonia, but now it's Croatia, Indonesia, the UAE, and many other countries. Italy is in active discussions actually with my research team, and they're trying to incentivize remote workers to come and live in that country for a short period of time, where they get certain tax benefits, but you're now being able to tap into a global labor pool that wants to travel and live in different parts of the country. My second recommendation is there are experiments now happening all over the United States, and I've studied one of them very closely, the Tulsa experiment. Tulsa, as you may know, is a small town in the state of Oklahoma, and they have been incentivizing remote workers to leave the large, over-congested coastal cities and come and live in Tulsa. And they have been able to attract over 1,300 families in the past 2.5 years. And these workers bring with them their jobs, so that they don't need local employment. And my research shows that they have been an active contributor to the local community in terms of local volunteering efforts. And this model now is being replicated in 14 cities by latest count in the US, in Kansas, in Arkansas, in Maine, in Vermont, in Hawaii. So beyond the national digital nomad visa, there's an opportunity for local organizations such as Tulsa Remote to incentivize remote workers and attract talent to the parts of the UK which have experienced brain drain for many, many years. And my final policy suggestion is in the spirit of the prior discussion, protect the rights of remote workers. Notably, I think Portugal took a first step recently to that regard. It's not a perfect piece of legislation, but it's making some progress. But notably, my suggestion has been we need more teeth with regards to companies not unfairly being able to monitor remote workers. Because I think my research has shown, and other people have shown this, it's counterproductive to judge the work of a worker based on input, how long you work. It's always more productive to base productivity measurement on work output, the quality of work, and the count of work, if possible. And the only circumstance under which input, how long I work, how many hours I work, should be measured is to monitor wellness. And so one of the suggestions I've given to many organizations, but also government entities around the world, is that productivity data, even if it's measured, should not be observed by the manager for purposes of performance evaluation. So those are my overall thoughts. Happy to take some questions. Thank you.
That's great, Raj. Thanks very much. Very interesting what you've said. But I mean, and you're very positive about the benefits of remote working. But is it the general case that these kinds of, if you like, surveillance of remote workers takes place as a matter of course, or is it the exception? What have you found in your research?
So I think it depends on the industry, as I think the gentleman before me was mentioning. It's probably more prevalent in the banking and finance industry. But there is a whole breed of what I call all remote organizations, notably GitLab and Zapier and Doist and Seek. And they have been in existence for several years now. And their model has been not to have any physical offices. And one of the common best practices all remote companies share is to measure productivity of workers based on work quality and the work output, and not to explicitly state in their company policies that they're not going to measure productivity based on work input, how long you work. So I think the tech sector is more progressive in that regard. The banking and finance industry needs to sort of be guided in that direction. And, those are my thoughts.
And you talked about more teeth. Does that mean that you think that there could be some form of underpinning by regulation in the way that you probably came in at a certain point this evening, but you heard some of our speakers talking about?
Yes, I think building on existing legislation is a wonderful idea. I absolutely love that. And I think the Portugal model might be also a model you could take a look at, and explicitly stating the rights of remote workers. For instance, they have one right explicitly stated as the manager cannot call the remote worker beyond a certain day of the time of the day. And explicitly having a Bill of Rights for remote workers would be a very progressive step, in my opinion.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Tim Gordon, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, look, thank you for a fascinating conversation this evening. It's been really interesting to hear all these different perspectives. I've just been observing some of the cases that are happening in Europe at the moment, notably in Amsterdam around the Ola and Uber cases, where the question has been raised about how explainable the AI has to be around some of the employment decisions being taken. And then a similar case earlier this year in Italy, where once again, the drivers were basically able to take the companies to court on the basis of the level of AI explainability under GDPR. How important do you think explainability under a GDPR for AI is and is going to be in the future?
Thank you. And I'll take another question from Lord Holmes, Chris Holmes.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. And thank you to all the panelists. Excellent, thought-provoking contributions. Firstly, to all the panelists, Birgitte, you set out very clearly how algorithms are being used, and I put used in single inverted commas. Do you think, though, there's anything in essence different to things that we've seen in the past? Certainly velocity is different, potentially extent is different, but is there anything essentially different from Taylorism, Fordism, and all those kind of other approaches? And to Raj, if I may, a couple of sentences on the Portuguese experience would be great. And greedily to all panelists, on the basis of what you set out in terms of exercising individual agency, would you advocate for all of us not to use these companies and not to work for these companies? And if not, why not? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. And then we've got Lucas for our third question. Lucas Stiglish.
Hi. Yeah, my question is a general one to all panelists or whoever wants to comment, and it's about their opinion on the use of data protection law, or to what extent should data protection law should or not be used to mitigate the impacts of algorithms at work. Obviously, in the case that James was mentioning, it was an important part of it. But yeah, to what extent should we use that kind of law versus look in other places.
Yeah, that's great, Lucas. That really follows on from Justin's contribution. But I'm going to start with Alexandra, and really, I'd just say to our panelists, answer whichever of the questions that you feel most like answering. So that, Alexandra, if you want to talk about Uber or Ola, absolutely fine, or Chris Holmes's rather more extensive questions, or indeed the GDPR point that Lucas raised.
Sure, and I'll be quick. I'm going to allow people who've been directly involved in that litigation to talk more about the Uber and the Ola cases. I'll go to Lord Holmes's question about how is this different from other innovations in the workplace that we've seen before. I think it's an important question. There's no question that we've had disruptive moments in workplace environments in the past. But I do think there are a couple of things that are different here. One is the extreme blurring of the personal space and the workplace that has come with new technologies. That is both in the case of working from home, but even for people that are still going into an office or into a factory and leaving their home. The fact that employers can be looking at your social media posts, have access to the keypad strokes that you make on a computer. And we all know that we do a little bit of personal browsing on our work computers, even if it's not technically allowed, and that should still be accommodated. That blurring of the workplace and the private exposes all of us to new privacy harms, and in particular to the inferences that employers can make about us based on our personal traits and preferences. A second is just the sheer pervasiveness of tracking. It's one thing to be on a factory line and to know that the pace is being enforced quickly by how quickly the conveyor belt is moving. That's an old innovation that's existed for decades. It's another for now all forms of work to be quantified in this way, to be pressured and tracked and monitored, and to be so that you never really step away from the conveyor belt. But indeed, even when you do, you are being monitored too. And I think the last real difference is the opacity of evaluation. So in the past, even when there was indeed increased automation or measurement in the workplace, you knew that your speed of work was being measured, right? You know, were you keeping up with the delivery pace that was happening at your workstation? This now is allowing tracking and monitoring that can be on many different factors and inferences about you. And to the point that many other people have testified today, we often have opacity as to exactly what is being measured, how it's being measured, and how those variables are being combined together. That really contributes to worker disempowerment, to us being unable to push back in a meaningful way, and to making sure that the things are being measured and used fairly. So I think all of those are unique considerations we need to take into account here.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Abby, over to you, and whichever one of the questions you might want to talk about the GDPR as to whether that is a useful instrument pending the passing of a Algorithmic Accountability Act.
Sure, thank you, Tim. Well, yeah, I suppose that we believe that there are various instruments within GDPR that can be better used and better tested, and we are concerned by some of the proposals for reform to the Act that have been put forward in Data in New Direction, not least the proposal for the removal of Article 22 in some instances, but also the new legitimate interest for data processing to improve services, which would essentially permit a vast range of applications in the workplace to be legitimised. And the government also made reference to international regimes that do legitimise any kind of decision making in the workplace as acceptable. So we don't think that that's what the promotion of good innovation does look like. And while we'd be supportive of a kind of regulatory regime that does promote innovation, we think that that has to be balanced with the interests of workers, as I suppose we've all been speaking to today. And that's why we believe that, and this in addition to a sort of substantial review that was conducted by a group called the Equality Task Force, who looked at the ways in which the current UK Equality Act and GDPR can come together to formulate an adequate response to the collective harms that are caused by these systems. The kind of conclusion of that expert group was that at the moment, the infrastructures that we have are not significant enough for redress of these collective harms and impacts. And that's why we would advocate for an Accountability for Algorithms Act, which would allow for kind of transparency throughout the whole innovation cycle, but also set out that formula for algorithmic impact assessment, which permits both engagement with relevant stakeholders, workers being included in that, assessment of impact across factors, mitigation of those impacts with transparency around what that mitigation was, and that ongoing audit and review.
That's great, Abby. Thank you very much. And James, I think Tim's question was very much directed at you as to whether, well, so what's the outcome?
Well, we were responsible for bringing that litigation in the Netherlands. So thanks for the question. I mean, firstly, I think it's important to understand that the purpose of that litigation was test litigation. It was strategic litigation to try and understand, test the GDPR, to test the limits of that. And we had some mixed results. We had some good results, but we also had some disappointing results. But nevertheless, interesting. One of the disappointing things is that the court felt the duty was on the worker to specify more clearly the information, the data, and the types of processing it wanted to examine of the employer. Well, that's problematic, because if you don't know what you don't know, but it also suggests that, workers who have a very intense digital footprint may have less of a right than maybe a consumer who has an occasional digital footprint. And where you have more at stake, you should, I think you should have more access rights in a way. But that's one point of appeal that we'll be making. But there were other really interesting bits. One was with Ola. The court found that Ola had engaged in automated decision-making related to wage deductions. And we believe it's the first time in Europe that that's happened with Ola. And in both Ola and Uber, the court ordered transparency on some of these anti-fraud detection systems that had led to dismissals on allegations that were completely unspecified. I suppose with all of these things, what it shows is that there's a limitation to litigation. We need other ways forward. We need a greater realization of rights. We need collective rights. We need trade unions working on this thing more, because we can't always find the solutions that we need in court. And to answer Lord Holmes' question about whether we should stop using these services, I would say no, absolutely not. We need regulation. We need consumers to play their part to demand more of these platforms as well. But also we need to recognize that in many respects that, sometimes workers are coming from a situation that's even worse. I remember at the onboarding session I attended with Uber some years ago, Uber had made this announcement that, at Uber, the work allocation decision is done by an algorithm. It's completely fair, transparent, it's colorblind, as opposed to the old backstreet dispatcher, the Danny DeVito type character from Taxi that you had to bribe and cajole and had favoritism. And when they announced that there was no controller at Uber, there was no dispatcher, it was done by algorithm, it was 100 people in that room who cheered for that. Really excited. It was a really emotional cheer. And I was, surprised to see 100 people cheer for an algorithm as a more fair way to do work allocation. So the promise of these technologies are always there, but the problem is not the technologies. The problem is us. The problem is managers, not the technology.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. Can I just press you a little bit on the data trust idea, because it ties in, I think, with what Mary was talking about in terms of workers, employees controlling their own data to a much greater degree. I mean, are you very much of the view that people like the Open Data Institute and those who are Ada Lovelace and so on, those who are constructing data trusts should be thinking in those terms as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is our objective to set up a data trust. And sadly, we've been foiled in being able to do that by most of the gig employers so far, just not providing the data in a consistent way that can be aggregated. We'll keep proceeding until we achieve that. But absolutely, I think it is absolutely right. And even in when that was tested in Amsterdam, in both Ola and Uber resisted on the grounds that we shouldn't have standing in Amsterdam coming offshore. That was rejected, but also the purpose of accessing data for the purposes of setting up a data trust. The courts recognized that workers were perfectly entitled to exercise their GDPR rights, to go beyond inspection, but actually to aggregate their data for a data trust. It's absolutely what we should be doing.
It's an interesting point about portability, isn't it? How far the right to that extends to employees and so on, I've no doubt. But we can no doubt pick that up at some future point. But Mary, whichever one of the extensive questions, and indeed you can talk about your ideas that tie in with James's data trust as well.
So maybe if I could just say something quickly about data protection and the UK GDPR. So we think that there are some really, really important protections under the UK GDPR. For example, the requirement to carry out data protection impact assessments, the rights under Articles 21 and 22, and indeed the restrictions on the circumstances in which data processing is lawful. But I think everyone, employers and workers, would benefit from more certainty over the operation of those provisions. And I think everyone would probably be agreed that the worst case scenario is where an individual has to legislate in order to clarify the precise meaning of the legislation. And so what we're saying is that it would be really, really helpful to have some more guidance on the operation of Articles 21 and 22, and also going back to some of the points that Justin was making about privacy and how Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights and the protections that affords to people who are working from home and may feel that their privacy is being infringed in some way, for example, by monitoring of their work while they're at home. We think that everyone would really benefit from some more guidance on the interaction between the protection under Article 8 and data protection legislation. So there are actually some, and that guidance could be provided relatively easily and quickly with some appropriate collaboration between the various different regulators and stakeholders. So that's something that we strongly advocate. And then also data protection legislation, although helpful, and again, we very strongly defended the UK GDPR in our response to the recent DCMS consultation, data reform consultation. But that said, there are some gaps. So for example, there aren't any provisions in the UK GDPR that would address the principle of non-discrimination. And so we're saying that there ought to be a provision in the UK GDPR stating that unlawful, that discriminatory data processing is always unlawful. So yeah, we've got a kind of two level sort of response in a way to the usefulness of the UK GDPR. One, there are some really great provisions there, but two, we do desperately need some statutory guidance, some more statutory guidance in terms of privacy and the operation of Articles 21 and 22. And then if I could perhaps just say something really quickly about the differences now in the operation of the technologies and the implications of that for workers. Just a very quick general point about scale, which is that the implications of the application of some of these technologies are so different now in terms of scale. So whereas before one might have a discriminatory culture in a single workplace, and a union would perhaps have some insights into how that was operating and who the individuals were that were responsible for that. We're now looking at technologies that might be repeating patterns of discrimination on a national and global scale in multiple workplaces. And what we say is that trade unions, in terms of the importance of collective action and a way in which that significance of scale can be counted, that unions have a really, really important role to play as a collective organisation, a collective and organisations that can provide collective voice and a counterbalance to that really significant implication of scale. And then also another indirect implication of a lot of these technologies is breaking apart human relationships and human connection, which has significant implications for collective action. And so that's another reason why we think it's so important to embed as a value human connection, in-person engagement, and the channels of communication that over significant periods of time unions have worked to establish between managers, workers and union reps. It's so important to protect those channels of communication and protect the importance of collective voice and collective action as a counterbalance to these really, really significant implications of scale that are posed by the technologies.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm very influenced by the book Hired, actually, which I thought was a really good book on all of this. And it adds, what has been said today really adds to that as well. Justin, just to bring you in, you're quite optimistic about the breadth of the GDPR, but you've heard quite a bit today that we need to add more specific to AI horizontally, if you like, in terms of transparency, freedom from bias, and so on. Where do you sit on this?
I think just Tim's question really on whether GDPR needs to have greater levels of explainability in it, and I think whilst it might not be calling on explainability specifically, there's a lot in it about justifiable and understandable and reasonable use that could come together to be able to create the foundations there for being able to build on top of that. So I certainly think that it is the good and right base for us to build on top of many aspects of how AI is being used in the workplace, especially, of course, because those algorithms that we talk about ultimately are algorithms that are processing a lot of personal data, and therefore digital protection laws are going to be very applicable. Lucas talked about mitigating the impact of AI in the workplace, and I think as we head towards the top of the hour, I'd like to just leave on a slightly more positive note, which is that whilst there will be certain aspects of the work that is done today that perhaps the AI will create a negative impact on, especially this dehumanized environment that was discussed earlier. The reality is that some of that repetitive work will be taken out by machines altogether, and we'll have to find new work. My hope is that the new work that we find is more exciting for many people, and as we look to the future, AI will take us into a better, brighter work of less repetitive work.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I'm going to give the final word to Raj, and you'll need to tell us about Portugal as well, I think, Raj.
Sure. So I'll comment on that. So thank you, Lord Holmes, for the question. So I think what the Act in Portugal does is an important step for the following reason. What I've been observing as a researcher is there's a competition going on between countries to attract digital nomads, migrants, who can come and spend a year or a couple of years in the country and work remotely. So Startup Chile, a program I've been studying for a while now, has done this for 10 years. And of course, because of that competitive dynamic, countries are doing really great on those policies. But there's also a need to protect the rights of domestic remote workers. And there are lots of issues to be sort of addressed here. Do you get the same compensation if you live in different parts of the country? Do you get the same benefits if you live in different parts of the country? Who gets to work remotely? What expenses are reimbursed? And Portugal has made a rather imperfect attempt, but a good first step in addressing such issues. So, for example, they have stated that till the age of 8, for parents of children who are till the age of 8, you just get to work remotely automatically. You don't need permission from your employer or the manager. Electricity bills are reimbursed. The internet expenses are reimbursed, and so on and so forth. So I think federally, it's important to do this, because the last thing I'll mention is in the US right now, there's a lot of uncertainty between the states. So Massachusetts, the state I live in, is in litigation with New Hampshire in determining whether workers who live in New Hampshire but work for Massachusetts-based companies pay taxes in New Hampshire or Massachusetts. So I feel there's a huge and very important role for the federal government or the central government to play in determining the rights of domestic remote workers. And that is what the Portugal Act is an example of.
Raj, thank you very much. And thank you very much to all our speakers. It's been a really, really interesting session. And we must return to this because this is clearly, one of the major priorities in AI governance. A huge amount of work has been done by IFO, by the TUC, and by many others, which help to inform us as we move towards this white paper. And I think all of us are beginning to form in our own minds a number of demands that need to be included. And I think this has been extremely helpful in determining that. So thank you very much to all our panel. A virtual clap to everybody. And thank you very much. And I hope to see you soon. And thank you to all our participants and questioners as well. Thank you very much indeed.